state law that created the exchange also requires that personal data has to be certified to you that it's secure. Last month, the executive director of the insurance exchange said she has virtually no idea where all the enrolling data is going because it's on a federal platform. Have you kept the feds out of Idaho, and are people's data secure?
Well, what we've tried to do is within the federal guidelines, we've tried to Idahoize their demands on our system. Not only by requests for exemptions and by negotiation with HHS, but also by some of the lawsuits that we have joined with other folks that have sought to bring lawsuit for one purpose or another against Obamacare. You'll recall when that law was passed, it was also anticipated that we would have our own system up and running. We still do not have our own system up and running because we were late to the party. The legislature in 2000, or the legislative leadership, after the July decision by the Supreme Court, we met and they requested, and I agreed, that I would not make that decision myself. So had we made that decision and had we made the decision to go forward with a state exchange, we would have had another 6 months, 7 months that we would have had, that we probably could have been more up to speed with our own system.
Is it a state-based exchange then?
It is a state-based exchange with the generalized information that we get off of the federal exchange. You understand what I'm saying? We're using basically their fiduciary figures. We're using their availability of the information on what policies can be offered and at what price. That part is the feds. And I say again, if we had started earlier, we probably would have been up to speed. We didn't start earlier. In fact, I think everybody was a little surprised how much they actually did get done and get prepared. But I would tell you that by the end of this year, it will be the Idaho state-based exchange. It won't, and we won't have the federal complex with it.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you.
Governor,
I apologize. I'm supposed to repeat the question. So when you ask me a question, because they're broadcasting this, screening this out. Yes, sir.
yeah, your budget materials mentioned, I think, $30 million in potential tax cuts after some of the education issues being taken care of, and you mentioned the increasing the exemption for the personal property tax. Is there other places where you'd like to see that $30 million in tax cuts go?
Well, you notice it doesn't say what kind of tax cut. It's a placeholder. And many times the placeholder, this is not unusual. As a result of me hearing from legislators and say, you know, we'd like to be able to consider this, we'd like to be able to consider that. And as we looked at the budget relative to revenues, that's why I didn't suggest that it was going to be go to $250,000 on personal property tax exemption or continue to lower the individual rates or the corporate rates, as I did last year. And so it's best to say that it's a placeholder. If there isn't a groundswell for it, then that money will probably find its way in some other use or savings.
So there's no, it's a placeholder, there's no specific spot where you'd like that to go with this time?
I'm willing to listen. All within the context of are we sufficiently moving forward on the 5-year plan for education? K through career. Is that it?
I'm sorry, Governor, I came in late. Did anybody
I'm
else?
sorry you're late. No, I'm not sorry you came.
The superintendent quibbled with the $21 million numbers that he gave, that that money comes out of the teacher pay line and pays for the task force, and he thinks you could do both.
Well, and the superintendent disagreed that we were not on the same paragraph yet, but we were on the same page. And the question was, is that 21 million come out of teachers' pay. And those discussions are going to continue. This is, I said earlier, Dan, before you got here, that this is not unusual. We've begun these discussions right after my blueprint goes out, and as you know, rarely does my printed budget become the legislative budget. And there's a lot of room in there for negotiation.
In the year that the legislature is reconvening its joint CEC committee to consider state employee compensation for the first time in 6 years, you propose zero funding for raises for state employees. How come?
Well, in the first place, Betsy, if you go back, at least in my history, I never proposed across-the-board CEC. I don't think that's my, that should be my responsibility or the legislature. Well, if they want to propose a certain level, like a 2% or 3%, I still want to lump sum that money to the directors of the agency. And in the last 3 years, as you know, we've created a lot of efficiencies and we've saved a lot of money. We then have allowed the agencies to take those savings and reward the people relative to their performance within their own agency. So you're right, there is no CEC, but it would be unfair and wrong to conclude that there hasn't been any salary increases for state employees. If there is a substitute for CEC, there is $12 million in the budget for us to pick up as $12 million worth of the increased medical insurance costs by state employees.
You said no to Medicaid expansion in the coming year, but you did recommend an increase for the catastrophic fund of, I think it was 3.4%, more than the overall increase for health services. How do you feel about staying on that track with our system that we have?
I think I tried to explain at the press conference last Friday that we have gotten certain concessions from HHS and from Obama's director of HHS that we will allow us to manage our Medicaid based upon a lot more personal involvement of the person receiving the Medicaid services. But also that we wanted to pay for outcomes rather than just every time somebody came across the threshold of the doctor's office. We've received both of those. But I want them implemented before we expand Medicaid, or I want to get down the road a long way toward implementing them, because I still have ringing in my ear, if you like your doctor, you can keep it. Or if you like your insurance policy, you can keep it. So I want to see those institutionalized in our operations and other states that are now asking for the same thing that I asked for, and see how they work. Plus the fact that I think that we're really finding out a lot of new stuff about Medicaid expansion, especially if you take a look at Arkansas. Or I mentioned Arkansas, Indiana, and Iowa. But Arkansas is, if you look at theirs, they're using their Medicaid expansion to provide money to otherwise Medicaid recipients to buy insurance policies. Pretty creative, I thought. And the more I see these private sector products coming forward, frankly, I think in maybe shorter, but I think by 5 years from now, there'll be no state exchange in Idaho. I think that the private sector has responded to the potential and the opportunity to provide additional leadership and to create products that we're not going to need a state-based exchange. That's my direction.
I apologize for coming a little late. When I came in, you were talking about how your education proposals come first And as I understood from your speech, that's before any tax cuts. Were you also saying that's before the deposits to the rainy day?
No. No, 71 million going into the rainy day fund lifts that up to within about 125 million of what I had in savings when I became governor in '07. Remember, it was around 400 million. This payment to PISA, to the Public School Education Stabilization Fund, to the Rainy Day Fund, and Budget Stabilization Fund, and to higher education, just 7 million to higher education. You add all those up, plus what we've got in there now, bring us to about $273 million in savings as a buffer against an additional economic downturn, which is very possible. Yes, sir.
Governor, you referenced in your speech some possible tweaks, and that's my paraphrase, but some possible tweaks to the Workforce Development Fund. I think you're alluding to that. Are you displeased with what the Workforce Development Fund produced in the case of the Heinz Corporation or Hoku, and what might you envision in the future? And could the private sector train their own employees?
Well, sure. But you know, I'll tell you, one of the examples that I looked at is in the expenditure of those workforce development funds, is that the new Simplot plant over in Colorado, that's 100% operated by computers. New technology. Probably every other year or so, they're going to have to write a whole bunch of new software for it. And Boise State, well, everybody's telling me we're simply not turning out the engineers that we need to. And so we want to encourage the private sector, number one, to create those kind of jobs. And in creating those kind of high-paying, very effective jobs for our economy, we want to be able to supply those jobs.
Governor, to go back to how the numbers add up, your comments about the prospect of tax relief sounded a bit lukewarm to me. You clearly said education comes first and the rainy day comes along with that. If the revenue figure comes in from the legislature at 5.5% rather than the 6.5% that you're assuming?
6.4.
6.4. That's close to the $30 million. It's 29 million, I think, for every 1%. Is that what gets kicked off the ship first?
Well, I'm not gonna signal out ahead. I want to know the rhyme and the reason, and I want to know not only that, but where do we go next year, and where do we go in 2016? If we set ourselves up for ongoing revenue requirements, are those revenues going to be there for the expenditures, whether it's tax relief or anything else that we give up this year? You understand what I'm saying?
I'm not sure I do.
All right.
I'm asking, a question about priorities.
Priorities, education. Priorities, education, workforce development, VOTEC, K through career.
Well, and Betsy said, and the rainy day. So the tax cuts are third on that list.
Well, the rainy day is K through career.
Okay.
The rainy day, if you start a program, if you start a STEM, a major advancement in STEM, and we get the students fired up to enroll in those classes, we don't want to offer them 1 year. And so that's why the money goes into Higher Education Stabilization Fund and to the PISA, the Public School Education Stabilization Fund. But I don't want to start something that I haven't got at least a comfortable zone of being able to continue the following year. Yes, sir.
You talked about, when you're talking about tax relief, needing to look at, are those revenues going to be there in future years if we're giving them up? And that makes me wonder whether you and legislative leaders have had conversations about shifting from a one-year budget to either a biennial budget or a longer-term budget.
The question was, are we, myself and the legislature, considering a multi-year budget, a 2-year budget or something like that instead of a year by year. No, we haven't had those discussions. Those discussions kind of went the way of the biennial sessions in 1966. And if you'll recall, one of the reasons we went to the annual session is because they were always calling special sessions because they were budget long or budget short. And failing to have a surplus eliminator or something like that, which was kind of a nice invention to have to come up with because we didn't always have surpluses. So that sort of went the same way that the biennial sessions went. But we have had no such discussions about it.
I guess I'm just curious from your business background. Companies may do annual budgets, but they also do long-term financial planning.
Oh, well, yeah. And in fact, we do a long-term budget as well. Even though we only talk about 1 year, we're saying if we're going to spend this money on a new program in the Department of Labor, or the Department of Commerce, or Education, can we sustain that out 5 years? And probably usually 5-year windows are what we look at. And what makes us believe that the revenues are going to be there? So can we justify and convince ourselves that if we spend $20,000 today on a program, that we're not going to have to discontinue it next year, or the next year, or the next year? So we want to be relatively certain that those programs are going to be there. That's one of the reasons that I continue to be probably a little more conservative than a lot of folks when I'm looking at my revenues. Because the most dysfunctional thing I think you can do in government is to have holdbacks. And I've gone through 2 of them. I've gone through 10 of them when I was lieutenant governor. I don't think we went through any. I'd have to count them up. But I asked our economic people to say, how many since I've been around here, how many holdbacks have we gone through? 10. So that means we spent more money than we had. And so the next legislative session, we were either faced with raising taxes, which happened quite a bit, or telling somebody that we'd already told them that they were going to have $1 million now, halfway through the year, now you only have 900,000. Very dysfunctional. Yes, sir.
Public knows that education is number 1. Task force, you're approving of that. $350 million bill. In terms that they can understand what happened today.
In terms of what they, well, and I hope I made it clear. I wrote, this budget represents the ink year. So I wrote it out in ink saying, this is what I'm willing to do. Legislature, let's sit down and talk about this blueprint because this is an ink. In the process, all right, what's going to happen 4 years out, the next 4 years out? That's why I said we're writing that in pencil. So that if we've got an expectation on 54 million bucks that we're spending this year, and what's going to happen, and how well are they going to use those monies, what's the best practice as a result of using those money, then we can reflect it. We can erase those lines or erase those numbers and put big numbers in. Put bigger. We're maturing faster than we thought we would. So we can put bigger numbers in there if we've got the revenues next year. And so maybe, even though we're ending up here with a 5-year plan, one in ink, 4 in pencil, you know, if it matures fast enough, the revenues are there, good enough, it could be 3 years.
You made a comment that maybe some are going to say it's not front-loaded.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate?
Well, you know, the figure is rightfully used, $82 million in operational funds that we're taking out. But in the meantime, as I said before, yeah, I see that as a priority of replacing. But I also know that during that downturn, there were some other things that we did in order to save money, in order to create more efficiencies. I don't want to lose those. So we'll see how we deploy the 54 million bucks and how successful we are with it. And then next year, we can make those adjustments. So I see I have every reason to believe that 54 million bucks can be handled pretty easy. And it's not going to bloat the budget. But I'm not going to lose $3.8 million in energy efficiencies that we got in during the meantime. Did you hear that story?
Devil's advocate on education, the superintendent of public instruction has actually said that this budget cuts teacher salaries, either to $13 or $21 million, depending on how you look at it. He says we can do both. We can restore operational funding and salaries. Where do you take the money to get salaries that he's talking about?
Where does he get the money?
Where do you get it? Where does he get it? Does it come out of the $30 million?
My budget's structurally sound. My budget is structurally sound. Every dollar that I spend on ongoing expenditures, salaries, whatever, those revenues are fully expected again next year and the year after and the year after. I am spending a lot of one-time money. My budget is about 2.5, but the overall budget is 4.4 because there's a lot of one-time money being spent. But none of that one-time money is being spent on ongoing. And so, and as we've already discussed before you came in, there's a placeholder of $30 million in tax relief.
Governor?
Yes.
So you said that savings, the 3 savings accounts, that's a priority.
I said what?
The savings accounts are a priority for you. Sorry. If that's the case, why do it as a surplus eliminator instead of committing the money or proposing to commit the money up front?
Well, when we had some savings, and we ran into that economic downturn starting in 08, we were careful not to spend all those savings, that $400 million, in 08, or 09, or 010. And it took us 4 years because we were careful how we spent that money to maintain as much sustainability, especially in education, as we could. There were agencies that were taking 30 and 40% cuts. Education took 7.5%. And lastly, fine, that was the last place that we went. So when I say after education, savings is a priority. I also mean that sustainability of the education money we spend is also a priority. It's the second priority. And I don't want to get a cash flow or an unbalanced structural budget a year from now. If anything happens to this economy, I think I explained at the AP thing the other day, is that if you were to go to a financial counselor and say, you know, I may lose my job, or I may have some downsides here in the next year or so, that financial counselor is going to tell you to have at least 50% probably of your needs in savings and in the bank, so that you don't have that disruption. I think that's good. We're not going to get to 50% in Idaho because that'd be $700 million. Well, maybe we will. I think I've got agreement amongst the leadership to lift the cap so that we can put more money in savings.
Folks, we have time for one more question.
You mentioned a $15 million line item for water sustainability initiative.
Right.
How much of that is for aquifer recharge on a snake or a
Well, the water board is going to make those calls, but the recharge of the Eastern Snake River aquifer has always been a high priority for us. You know, on the snake itself, the lower end of the snake, I can tell you, I think it's going to cost us about $3.5 million for Mountain Home Air Force Base to buy up those senior water rights, so they have sustainability at Mountain Home. That's why I said these are projects from Rathdrum, Highland Park to Arrow Rock, all over the state.
Speaker Benke had mentioned that essentially he lobbied too heavily on this line item. How much of an influence did he have?
Well, you know, I would say Scott's information which was validated by the Water Resources Board on need and on priority. That was very important in our decision. And fortunately, we had a little bit of money to do just that. All right, guys, gals, thanks.
Thank you all for coming.
You bet. Thanks, Austin. Happy New Year to you. Thank you all.
I need to go back to the office. Yeah, my laptop's toast. So they were gonna buy me a new one, but they did.